Okay, now yesterday we were using our trig ratios. Remember, sine, cosine, tangent. We were using our ratios to find a missing side. Now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to use our ratios, but we're going to find an angle this time. Find the measure of the indicated angle to the nearest degree. Okay, so the nearest degree, that means I want you to round it to the nearest whole number. Your answer will be as a decimal, but rounded to the nearest whole number. Let me remind you guys of an acronym. So, ka, toa. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent is opposite over adjacent. Right? The hypotenuse is the biggest side. Based on our theta, or based on our corner, besides the hypotenuse, opposite means far away and adjacent means close to. All right, so let's take a look at number 25. That question mark, notice how the angle, it's a question mark. Let me call it X to begin with. In algebra, that was last year, in algebra, we learned that when we don't know the value of something, we replace it with the letter, usually X or Y, but choose any letter. I'm going to choose X this time. Now, let me label the two sides that I have. I have the hypotenuse. Now, the 29, I have to figure out whether it's the opposite or the adjacent. Based on the angle, right, where X is, based on that corner, I'm going to say 29 is the adjacent. So I have A and H, and I'm going to remember the acronym Ka. That means cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So I'm going to say in this case, cosine of X, right? I don't know the angle, so it's cosine of X equals 29 over 38. I can grab my calculator, figure out what 29 divided by 38 is. It's a big decimal. I'm not going to quite do that yet. Now, my thing here is, I wish I had X by itself. Cosine of X, I cannot break it apart. I cannot just divide by cosine, right? I cannot just do that. That I have to do something that separates them. But now the cool thing we're going to learn this time, I wish I could just do the X with the fraction. I wish I could just swap them, and I can't. The only thing is that because I'm gonna break cosine of X, my X and my fraction are going to switch places, but instead of calling it cosine, I'm gonna call this cosine inverse. I'm gonna use that -1 as an exponent. It is not -1 as an exponent. It's just the way we're going to write this, but we're going to read that as cosine inverse of 29 over 38 is equal to X. So the X and the fraction switch places, but instead of cosine, I'm going to call this cosine inverse. Okay. Now I can easily type that. Let me grab a calculator. I'm going to use the one from Canvas. Now, one thing, every time I open my calculator, usually starts in radians. I'm dealing with degrees, so make sure you switch it back to degrees. Every time you open the calculator for the first time, so make sure you're dealing with degrees. Now, I know I had cosine inverse. It looked like a cosine to the -1. I see here cosine. Cos at the bottom, that's not cosine inverse. However, here on my calculator, you guys see there's a second. Sometimes, depending on your calculator, it might say second, it might say shift. Let me press this key second, and look, my cosine is cosine inverse. All right, so I'm going to press that. Now, I see a cosine. Okay, so the reason why is because some people don't call this cosine inverse. Some people call it arc cosine. It's just pronunciation. Just be tomato, tomato, potato, potato, right? I read it as cosine inverse, but some people, like I said, read it differently. Arc cosine, that's how they read it. So I have cosine inverse, and my fraction was 29 over 38. So I'm going to go 29 divided by 38. Okay, that's 29 over 38 is 29 divided by 38. Let me close this. So I do have what I needed to have, cosine inverse of 29 over 38. Let me press equal, and it says 40.2. Remember, I'm going to round it to the nearest whole number. 40.2, that 2 is too small, so it does nothing to my 40. So my answer in this case, I'm going to say x is equal to 40. Remember, 4 degrees, I'm going to round it to the nearest whole number. So 40.2 will be incorrect. You have to round it to the nearest whole number. All right, let's take a look at number 26. In this case, I do have the hypotenuse and I have the adjacent. That question mark, let me change it for x. And I remember the acronym CA. So I'm going to say cosine of x is equal to 45 over 52. Adjacent over hypotenuse. Again, I want the x and the fraction to switch places. They will, but instead of cosine, I'm going to call this cosine inverse, or like people like to call it arc cosine, but I call it cosine inverse. Okay, so cosine inverse of 45 over 52 is equal to x. Okay, let me pull up my calculator. Let me type this in. Let me erase this. Since I press second, I already have it there. So cosine inverse 45 divided by 52, press equal, and it tells me my degree is 30.0. Remember, I'm going to round it to the nearest whole number. 30.0 rounds to just 30. So my x in this case is 30 degrees. Let's take a look at question number 27. I do have the hypotenuse this time. My question mark here, let me call it x. And based on that angle, I have the opposite. So I remember the acronym SO. That basically stands for sine is opposite over hypotenuse. I'm going to say sine of x is equal to 4 over 7. So sine inverse of 4 over 7 is equal to x. Remember that the x and the fraction are going to switch places, but instead of sine, I'm going to call sine inverse. Or some people call it arc sine, okay? So I'm just going to type that in. Let me bring my calculator. So sine inverse of 4 divided by 7 equals 34.8. Okay, that 8 is big enough, right? Big enough is 5 or more. That 8 is big enough, so the 8 is going to push the 4 up. So when I round this to the nearest whole number, I'm just going to call this 35. Let's take a look at question number 28. I have the hypotenuse. Based on the angle, I have the opposite. I remember the acronym SO, which means sine of x is equal to 57 over 59. So that means that sine inverse of 57 over 59 is equal to x. Let me type this in. So clear this out. Sine inverse of 57 divided by 59 is equal to 75.0. All right, so running it to the nearest whole number, I'm going to say 75. Okay. Number 29, that angle is x. Right, I don't know it. I don't have the hypotenuse. In this case, I have the opposite and the adjacent. So I remember the acronym TOA, which means tangent of x is equal to 12 over 39. That means that tan inverse of 12 over 39 is equal to x. Okay, so now let me grab my calculator out. Tan inverse of 12 divided by 39 is equal to 17.1 rounded to the nearest whole number. So 17.1, I'm going to round that to just 17. Our last example here, the angle is x, because I don't know it. I have the hypotenuse and I have the adjacent. I remember the acronym CA, which stands for cosine of x equals 26 divided by 40. That means that cosine inverse of 26 over 40 is equal to x. Okay, so let me type this in. Let me grab my calculator out. Cosine inverse of 26 divided by 40, 49.4. Okay, so I'm going to round that to just 49. There, you guys can see what we did. There you go.